this evening, I'm going to do something slightly different to what we did in the previous two evenings, because I did one topic for the evening and went into that at some length. But this evening, I'm going to mix and match it a little bit. So I've called this a mixed bag of things to do with context and why context matters. So some of these will be the archaeological context, and some will major on things like the geography, or maybe the cultural context of people in the Bible times, and so on. So, and different ones will emphasize different aspects of that. And yes, linguistic context as well, and idioms and those sorts of things. So that we're going to start with that kind of thing. So this first, and I'm going to do 5 or 6 of these little sections, and so I'll be jumping around a bit, and I'll have, as usual, some pictures to show, just to kind of set the scene and have something more interesting than me to look at. So quite a few years ago, when I started doing a bit of teaching to some young students in St Aldate's, where I attend in Oxford, I was doing some teaching about introduction to the Old Testament and the New Testament, and teaching them about the importance of context. And I wanted to think of a verse in the Bible that, in the space of one verse, packed in a fair bit of things that I could talk about. And the one verse I came up with was Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. So those of you who've got a Bible to hand, you might just want to turn that up. That's Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. And the old timers will probably recognize this when I read it. So this is Jeremiah speaking the words of the Lord. And he says, "My people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and have hewed out systems for themselves, broken systems that can hold no water." So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just share my screen. So hopefully that's now, you can see that. And a number of you, if you've been to Israel, you may well have visited this place. This is En Gedi, down in the Judean desert. And we're talking about living water just for this little section. And water is really important here. And the first thing to appreciate is that living water is actually an idiom. And I never knew, when I was kind of attending church as a youngster, that I thought it sounded good and positive, and you really wanted to have it because it just sounds great. But I never actually knew what it was. But living water is an idiom that just means spring water. Spring water, pure and great and life-sustaining, that comes out of the ground. Sorry, wait a minute, I've just gone the wrong way. Let's get right. Okay, and here in En Gedi, walking around, actually there are times when you can come across an actual spring that is coming straight out of the rock, and here's one of them, and a close-up of one is here. I mean, this is just a solid block of rock, but water's pouring out of it, and the birds come and have a dip and a splash as well. And so this is an illustration of living water. Now, one of the reasons why I like this particular verse in Jeremiah is because that once you've understood it, you then realize the actual power behind what Jeremiah is saying on behalf of the Lord to his people who are backsliding. But to do that, to get that point of understanding, you need to know a bit about climate and geography and geology in Israel. So this is what we're going to talk about for a short while. Now, in Israel, back in biblical times, were really 3 kinds of water that you could use just in ordinary ways and in ordinary living, particularly those Israelites living in the hill country, which for many centuries was most of them. The 3 types of water are spring water, which is living water, and then there was groundwater, which required someone at some time to build a well, and you could drop your bucket down, and sometimes these wells in Israel are really, really deep. And sometimes you have to, if the water table goes down a bit, then you have to get somebody to go down there and dig the well a bit deeper. And it has to be carefully constructed so it doesn't collapse in on itself. So well water, that's not bad, or sometimes called groundwater. And the third option is cisterns, that's rainwater that's been collected in a cistern and kept. Now, you're wondering, well, why do they have to do that? Well, this then comes into the question of climate. I think I've got a picture here. Oh, okay, yes. Here's what I could describe as a hole in the ground. Actually, it's a cistern. But so sometimes they're nothing to look at the top, and often, actually, and deliberately so, the opening at the top is very narrow, so that you don't get much light in. And but because when light or sunlight shines inside, then it's got a tendency to grow algae and all that kind of stuff. So that's a cistern in the hills next to the Valley of Elah, oddly enough. So the other thing to factor in terms of the context is the climate. Now, obviously, this part of the world in Israel is described as having a Mediterranean climate, and that means hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. And in the summer, there's almost no rain for 6 or 7 months. And so if you are a poor farmer living off the land, where does your water come from for your plants and your animals and your family? Well, I mean, if you're very lucky, you might have a spring, but actually those are hard to come by. But rather more may have access to a well, but many, especially in the hill country of Judea and Samaria, would have to rely on the water collected in the winter and collected in the cistern. Now, I'm going to show the next picture. Okay, this is a cistern, and this happens to be at Qumran, but that's not so much the relevant point. So sometimes cisterns were built as very big storage areas for water, and sometimes they were much smaller. The one I showed you previously was more like the small family one, and this one was a larger one constructed by the people who wanted to store vast quantities of water because they were quite enthusiastic about ritual purity. But what I want you to notice on this picture here is that the wall in the top half of that picture, you can see multiple layers of plaster on the wall, and that's characteristic of cisterns. The reason why you have to have these cisterns is that goes to the context of geology. Now, those of you who visited Israel know that when you're traveling around, and if the road cuts through and you can see the bare rock, it's usually pale colored, kind of limestone or chalk. And what that means really is that when rainwater falls on the land, it just seeps into the ground. And it's really quite unusual in the hill country of Judea and Samaria to have streams running along the surface of the ground. They would almost always sink into the ground, and then because of the porosity of the limestone, and then they would come out as a spring somewhere further away when it hits an impermeable layer. So that's the geological aspect of the situation, that there's just not very much running water available. And then you have this problem of 7 months in the summer of no rain, and you have to store the winter rains so that you've got rains for the other half of the year. Now, chiseling out a cistern is perfectly possible, but then there's another snag that you have to factor in, and that's because Israel is in an earthquake zone. The whole of the Jordan Rift Valley is an extension of a fault in the earth that goes all the way through East Africa. And you probably know there are earthquakes mentioned in the Bible. There's one in Amos chapter 1, verse 1, where he talks about that after the earthquake. And usually the normal experience is that you get very very small earthquakes that don't really, sometimes you don't notice them. But then every so often, and someone's calculated roughly about every 400 years in that part of the world, you get a big, rather destructive earthquake, and various ones in between. And I think the most recent, not mega destructive, but medium destructive earthquake in Israel was in 1927, and it made a bit of a mess of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. They had to do a lot of rebuilding work. But the point is that Israel is in an earthquake area, and these little earthquakes, or these little kind of tremors, are not unusual, but they don't do any real damage. But what they do is cause plaster to crack. And if you've plastered your cistern, and then just you get a little earthquake that maybe you don't even notice, only the animals notice it, and then you might find that the water that you collected in your cistern is just seeping away. And just go on to this picture here. This is actually another picture from Qumran, and you can see a series of steps going down, but there's something gone wrong in the middle of the steps, and that's earthquake damage in that part of the country, which caused a displacement in the two sides of the steps going down. But that wouldn't have been caused by a fairly serious earthquake. But the common experience is that you do get quite frequently these little earthquakes that will crack the plaster in your ceiling or whatever in your wall. And so what's happening here in this verse that we've just read from Jeremiah is that the Lord is comparing. He's challenging his people because what they've done is that they've exchanged the Lord as a source of fresh and living water for water that you get from a cistern. But then they're broken cisterns that can hold no water. And even if they do manage to hold water, it could well be by the end of the summer, the water's turned brown and slimy, and maybe even certain living, crawling things are inside it. And it just really, you're thinking, wow, I'm going to have to drink that. So when you understand that in terms of this contrast between pure living water and slimy, murky cistern water at the end of the long, hot summer, the contrast is very stark. And so I'm going to read this verse again. I'm going to add into it verse 12. And maybe then you can realize the power of what the Lord is saying in this verse. Jeremiah says from verse 12, "Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked and utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." Okay. Right, now, so that's that topic. We're going to go on to number 2 now, which is called the salt of the earth. And let's see if I've got, okay, we've got a different picture here. Now, I like this thing to do with the salt of the earth, because this comes from, as I'm sure you know, from a verse in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's obviously a very well-known verse, but actually not well understood, which is a surprise to when you find out what's going on here. So anyway, this bit of context we're looking at is kind of social practices and the quirks of geography, and you'll maybe understand that when we get to the end. So I will read the verse where this comes from the Sermon on the Mount, though you probably all know it so well, but still worth reading. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." Yeah. So what is Jesus referring to here? Now, we will find out quite easily if we look at Luke's parallel passage. But first of all, I want to have you understand that the word earth in the phrase "the salt of the earth" could just as equally be translated the salt of the soil. In other words, so you, Jesus was saying to his hearers, you are the salt of the soil. Because in fact, this is not referring to the refined salt used in the kitchen for flavor or taste or preservation. It's referring to something fairly unique to Judea and the region around Jerusalem. And I'll read the verse from Luke chapter 14, because this gives the big clue. So this is important to look up, because you may not have put these two verses together that talk about the salt of the earth. You may be more familiar with the one in Matthew than the one in Luke. So if you want to, turn to Luke chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. Okay, if you're there. What Luke says here is, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. Now, did you notice that both of those verses, the one from Matthew and the one from Luke, mentioned about the salt losing its taste? I think actually this was from the ESV. I can't remember actually which translation that does it. But the original Greek doesn't say taste it, but a better translation is to say if the salt has lost its saltiness, which is not a word we use, but actually it's more accurate in this context. So the thing is, Luke, you see, didn't grow up in Judea. He only visited it later on in life. If you remember, he traveled to Judea with Paul, and then Paul ended up in prison, and Luke was helping him when he was imprisoned in Caesarea. And I think actually, just as an aside, that the time that Luke had with Paul, those 2 years while Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, Luke traveled around the country and was really keen to get hold of eyewitnesses for the gospel that he was writing. Anyway, that's a little aside. Now, it's not obvious, actually, what is being referred to by the salt of the soil. But Luke helps us, because he puts in this phrase, if its saltiness cannot be restored, it's neither good for the soil or the manure pile, and it's thrown away. So Luke is actually telling us that one of the uses of salt, this kind of salt, was to scatter it on the field. And actually, what this salt looked like was more like the rock salt you see on roadsides in the winter, which they spread on as grit. They spread on roads. It contained all sorts of things, but actually it's a lot less sodium chloride than ordinary ocean salt, that you get across the world, because of its much higher content of other minerals. And it was chalk sand and other grit. So it was sort of in its impure state, and it was just taken up probably on the back of donkeys up from the Dead Sea into Jerusalem and sold as fertilizer. And even though it's got salt in it, if you took it and you spread it thinly on the ground, then the potash content of the fertilizer meant that it was able to do what potash does and cause plants to grow and to bear fruit and to flourish. So you see, this is not really obvious unless you know this quirk of Dead Sea salt and this practice of just using it in that part of Judea as a fertilizer. And Luke wrote in his gospel about if the salt has lost its effectiveness, then it's no good. People just throw it out. It's no good for the soil or for the manure heap, because that's not obvious unless you live around there. But those who live there, they just take it for granted. They know what it's talking about. So when Jesus says, you are the salt of the soil, he's saying that you are like fertilizer, that when you spread thinly, you cause good things to happen in society. You cause blessing and growth and fruitfulness. And this is the picture he's talking about. He's not talking anything to do with the use of salt in the kitchen or for flavor. And this, the other aspect that Luke talks about is that it's neither good for the soil nor for the manure heap. Now, the problem is with that situation that the people were in is they didn't have much access to wood for fuel. So in order to heat their ovens for their bread or whatever, they had to use dried animal dung, which is kind of commonplace in different parts of the world, having to use animal dung as a fuel. But the thing is, you would have to make sure, because it's fuel, that you kept it dry. So you have to keep it inside amongst where the animals are kept, maybe overnight, and maybe even in a space at the bottom of your house or in a cave next to your house. And what the Dead Sea salt will do then is it'll act as a disinfectant and reduce the kind of the pong, shall we say, for want of another word, and then make living with next to a manure heap not so much of a problem. But then the manure is then put in the oven and used as fuel. And when the fire dies down, you take the ash and then you spread the ash on the field as well. So actually, salt used in that way does double duty because it still ends up being used on the field. And one thing I've noticed, having lots of people will refer to the salt of the earth, and referring to people who are in a quiet and way, just get on with life and make a difference. But I've never heard anybody teaching from the front of the church the point that Jesus makes, which is never ever lose your ability to bless society, to make good things happen and bring things to maturity, because you'll get put on the rubbish heap. You get thrown out. So it's actually, Jesus is making a really powerful statement about, if you lose your ability by the power of the Spirit to make a difference, you're just going to be chucked out. So that's salt of the earth. So I expect there's some, apart from the irritating interruptions, I hope you managed to pick up the threads there. Okay, now I'm going to share the screen again. Let me just, okay, do this. Okay, can you see that? Okay, this is a picture of Capernaum, and it just happens to have a rainbow over it. So what I'm doing for this little section on Capernaum is a hint from archaeology. And a number of you may well have seen this white synagogue in this partly reconstructed synagogue in Capernaum, which is really quite impressive, I have to say. So and this is another view of it, to having someone in the picture to give a bit of a scale there. But what's interesting is that this white limestone synagogue is built right on top of the black rock, which is basalt, of the previous synagogue. Now, in this picture, if you look near the bottom, you'll see the foundations are black underneath the white stones. And as this sign further down that wall says, this is the 4th century synagogue called the White Synagogue, is built upon the remains of the synagogue of Jesus. And it's actually built in exactly the same place and exactly the same orientation. And this limestone synagogue in Capernaum was really quite large, and there's lots of bits of rock lying around, which is the ornamentation of the building. And it looks like quite an extravagant building, and ornately decorated. And I read recently a thought that somebody has, which says that this synagogue was built by Christians to commemorate the synagogue beneath that was graced by the presence of Jesus. Now, we can't prove that, but it's actually a nice thought that this impressive limestone synagogue, which would have been, quite expensive to build because the local stone is the black basalt, and you have to bring white limestone from further away in order to build with it. And that's one thing I wanted to say from the context of Capernaum and the archaeology. But I want to talk about another thing here. Now, this is a basalt grain mill. So, basalt being the common rock around there. And this is a close-up. And in the vicinity of the site in Capernaum, there are lots of these to be seen. Now, what I want you to notice is that it's made of two stones, one stone sitting on top of the other one, and the top stone has got is carved out so there's sockets in both sides, and then a hole, and a dowel can go through the hole. And what goes into the socket is a wooden rod which acts as a handle to enable you to turn it. So that wooden handle is held in with a wooden peg going across it. And it would have been the daily task of women to use something like this to grind the barley or the wheat for making flour. Now, on the right-hand side of this picture, you can see one of these. I think it's the top millstone you can see the hole in it. And the bottom one is like a cone shape, and the top stone sits over the cone shape, fits very neatly, and then you turn the top stone in order to, and the grain falls through and comes out as a powder, or roughly a powder, for then subsequent usage. But anyway, the one thing I wanted to say was that Jesus had this kind of two-woman mill in mind when he said, 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. So there we are. And as I say, there's lots of these mills in and around the site in Capernaum. But it's nice to realize that this is such a commonplace feature, and this was a 2-woman mill, and just ideal for what Jesus wanted to say. Okay. Now I'm going to go on to another section, and this is going to be a quick visit to Mount Carmel. I don't know whether people have been there themselves, but it's definitely worth a visit for various reasons. So I'm going to just share my screen again. Okay. Now, when you go to Mount Carmel, I'm talking about here the site which is associated with Elijah's showdown with the prophets of Baal. But there's a platform there. There's a platform on top of the Carmelite monastery, and they've got an observation area. And what you can do is you can look over the Valley of Jezreel, which is this very large flat area with lots of bits of water, and you're looking towards Galilee here. And actually, halfway up on the right-hand side will be Nazareth, and just behind it is in the distance is a rounded hill, which is Mount Tabor. Okay, so I'll just go on to next. And this is also taken from the same place on a time when I was there. And this is a view looking northeast from Mount Carmel, and you can actually see Mount Hermon in the distance, and that is 65 miles away from Mount Carmel. It was a particularly clear day on that one when I visited there. This isn't my picture. My camera wasn't quite good enough for this picture, but somebody there gave it to me. So a great place for these imposing views. And here's another picture looking down from that observation platform, looking down to the lower hills of the Carmel range. So Elijah had set up this contest between the prophets of Baal and himself. There had been 3 years of famine in the land, and Elijah was a wanted man, and people were looking for him, but they couldn't find him. And anyway, he turned up and he presented himself to King Ahab and set out this challenge to the prophets of Baal and to this showdown on Mount Carmel. But this little clip here, this little section I'm talking about, has to do with understanding the religious context of what was going on at the time. I'm just going to go on. So this is a chapel next to the Carmelite monastery, and quite nicely what they've done here is that they've got an altar built on top of 12 large stones, reminiscent of the 12 stones of the altar that Elijah used. And going on to the next one, if you've visited this place, it's actually called Muhraka, which means it's Arabic for sacrifice. So this Carmelite monastery on this point in Mount Carmel, everybody will have seen, that visited that, will have seen this statue of Elijah looking very powerful and dominant. And it's this statue that I want to talk about. But first of all, let's look at this. Now, this is not a very clear picture, so you're going to have to shuffle up closer to your computer if you want to kind of see the things I'm talking about. So this is what's called, this is a bas-relief carving on a stela, which is an upright stone with writing or carving on it. And this is a picture of Baal, of the god Baal, okay? And if you look carefully, his right hand is above his head, and it's holding a club or a rod of some sort. But in his left hand, he is holding what is intended to be a lightning bolt. And it ends with a point, and it's pointing down to the ground, but it's got kind of fire at the top. So no, this is, I got this picture from Wikipedia, and if you want to do a search for Baal and thunderbolt, those two words, and you'll get to the Wikipedia article where I got this image from. So this image is from an artifact which is held in the Louvre Museum in Paris, but it was found in a place called Ugarit on the coast of Lebanon, north of Israel. Actually not very far from the temple of Baal, which was dug up there. So there he is with a weapon, a rod in his right hand and a thunderbolt in his left hand. So the modern way of describing him would be to say one of his superpowers was to strike the earth with lightning bolts. Now, another thing I want to point out is at the bottom of this stone slab, you have to look very carefully to see this, are two sets of wavy lines. So these are in the picture, they're under his feet. And what that means is that they are the things which he has dominion over. And one of these sets of wavy lines represents the hills, and the other set of wavy lines below it represents the water. So these were the things that Baal was seen to have dominion over, because he was primarily worshipped as a fertility god and a storm god. He brought fertility to the land and animals by providing rain, and he showed his power in the storm. And mountains such as Mount Hermon in the north that we saw, and then Mount Carmel, were believed to be his natural stronghold, where his power in terms of rain and storm was most evident. So when Elijah presents Ahab, and then in turn the prophets of Baal, with this challenge on Mount Carmel, such that the God who answers by fire, he is God. I think the prophets of Baal would have probably thought along these sort of lines. They would have thought, one, we have got the home ground advantage on Mount Carmel, and we've got the numbers, in particular, 450 to 1. They did have the numbers. And we've got the power of the lightning bolts. This contest is going to be a complete walkover. Well, it wasn't. How wrong were they? Now I want to just go back to the picture of Elijah. And what I want you to do is to compare the pose of Elijah. Look, he's got his right hand and his weapon, right hand raised, and a weapon over his head, which is a sword. And he's standing in a similar pose to the god of Baal on that stela. But his left hand doesn't need to hold a lightning bolt. He just knows the one who holds them all. But notice under his feet, under his dominion, is one of the prophets of Baal. And I only noticed this just recently, that this statue of Elijah in this white stone is sending a message contrary, in the same way that the statue of Baal was sending a message of his dominion, but it's talking about the dominion and the power of God who turns up and proves that he is God. Okay, got that? We were able to see that the image of the from the stone slab. It's quite subtle, but you can go and look at it on the Wikipedia page, and if you want to study it more closely. But so having an understanding of this religious context and how the whole contest was set up biased completely in favor of the prophets of Baal, but then it was the Lord who answered by fire. Now I want to go on to talk about context of understanding Scripture, and in particular, I'm going to talk about Jesus' reputation as a healer. So this picture is taken from a hill on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Not a hill, it's a mountain. It's Mount Arbel, and it's looking down on the place called Magdala. That's presumably the hometown of Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. And it's a lovely place to visit, and lots of folk that I know really like to go there, and particularly into the chapel, which is, I'll try and point this out, the chapel is here very close to the shoreline, and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so this is the boat chapel that the Franciscans have built in Magdala. And so just imagine the fun of standing behind a boat with the Sea of Galilee in the background, preaching a sermon about Jesus' power over the elements. That's pretty cool. I like it. Haven't had the opportunity. But anyway, in this church also, there's a number of mosaics, and here's a mosaic featuring Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene has got these little black curiosities coming out of her, and that's to do with the 7 demons that were cast out of her, that the Bible tells us about. And then my last picture is also a part of that church. There's a room with where the floor is the ancient floor from 2,000 years ago, but they've put a mural on the wall which depicts an occasion you've probably worked out. It's the woman who had persistent bleeding, and she seeks healing by touching the hem of Jesus' garment. Now, this thought, that she had, I must touch the hem of his garment, was absolutely by no means unique to her. So this is what I want you to, if you've got your Bible to hand, to look up Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 56. because this says, wherever Jesus came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. So actually whole villages and cities had this same idea, that if we can only just touch the fringe of Jesus' garment, they will be healed. So how come everybody was on the same page in terms of that understanding? The key to this is you have to know a bit about the clothes that Jesus was wearing, and also something to do with the Hebrew word kanafim. So this is used in two passages which are linked together by virtue of this same word. So this word kanafim in Hebrew has several meanings, like Hebrew words often do, that various aspects to it. And it can be used to refer to corners, edges, borders, or wings. So you get that. I mean, those are similar concepts, but the word kanafim or kanaf in the singular can refer to those different aspects. Now, Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 to 40 contains the command given by Moses to the people of Israel that the men should wear tassels on the four corners of their outer garment. And when he says that, when he says, you make a tassel on the corners of your garment, the word for corner in that verse in Numbers is this same word Hebrew, kanaf, meaning corner. Now, what's happened in the minds of people in Jesus' time is they've taken this understanding where the tzitziot, these little tassels at the corners of the garment, were linked with another verse in Malachi, and maybe you want to turn to this one. So this is Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. Sorry, just getting there myself. Okay, this is what it says. Well, I'll read from verse 1. For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all the evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings, and you shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. Okay, so the phrase that I want to home in on is the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in his wings. Now that's Son as in S-U-N, not S-O-N. One can make that really clear, because I used to make that mistake. And I've got here on the screen this is a clay seal impression, and it's quite an important one actually. This was found in Jerusalem, and it says, and it belongs to no less than King Hezekiah. And it's got written on it in ancient Hebrew, Hezekiah, the son of Amos, the king of Judea. But what I want to point out to you is in the middle of that, if you can make it out, there is a sun with two downwards pointing wings on either side. And to the right-hand side, there's the Egyptian symbol called an ankh, which refers to life. So I'm just wanting to say that this idea of the winged sun, this motif, was actually common in the Middle East. And so it's a reference to it. But Malachi is saying that there will be someone who embodies this image, and he will have healing in his wings. Now, the important thing to appreciate is that the word wings in that sentence in Malachi is that same Hebrew word kanafim. So Jesus, what's going on with the people wanting to touch his hem? It's actually not really his hem or his fringe. These are the people who are actually wanting to touch the tassel on the corner of his outer garments, because he has healing in his kanafim. Okay, so that's a bit of putting together scriptures that you would really not know about unless you were familiar with the Hebrew behind it. But it's nice to know that the background, so you can kind of join the dots together. Okay. Now, yeah, the last one I'll just take will be my sixth one, and this will be about fishing in Galilee. So a kind of bit of a change of tack, and I'll again just have a switch to sharing my screen again because I've got some more pictures. So just go through. Okay, so here's a nice picture. It's a lovely view of the coast of the northwest part of the Sea of Galilee, and the bottom right-hand corner is Magdala that we were just talking about, and then going around the coast, you've got Gennesaret, Tagba, Capernaum, and Bethsaida. And Bethsaida's right in the distance on the far side. You only vaguely can see where it is, but this whole arc of the northwestern part of the Sea of Galilee was where Jesus spent a large amount of his ministry, going between the villages and the towns and preaching in their synagogues. And he would no doubt have preached in the synagogue of Magdala as well, and they have unearthed that in recent history. Just the next picture. Oops. I've got a picture here of a guy fishing. I couldn't find anybody doing anything more interesting method of fishing rather than just line fishing, but it's on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee. And one reason why it was a popular area for fishing, both in these days and in years ago, is that at the place called Tagba, which is about a mile down the road from Capernaum, there are hot springs. And in the middle of this picture, maybe you can see that there's a bunch of water flowing in, and it's flowing into the Sea of Galilee. But this is warm water. And the effect of this was to, particularly in the winter, to make this area of the Sea of Galilee just that little bit warmer. And so in the winter, the fish would like to gather around here, which meant that this was a key spot for doing your fishing, because the shoals of fish would be much larger. Anyway, that may be new to you, but anyway, there were some hot, warm springs flowing down into the Sea of Galilee in that location. Now, what I want to talk about, though, is not so much that is one particular kind of fishing. Now, the New Testament mentions 4 different kinds of fishing used in those days, and in order of kind of importance, there will be line fishing, like we just saw, a guy with a rod, basically, or just a line. Next up, there was cast net fishing. In other words, casting a net to try and catch some fish. And that's something that people could do on their own, and that it would usually be in shallow water. The next level up is dragnet fishing. And this is one where you use a much larger net and needs multiple people to do it. And the top level type of fishing, in other words, the most productive sort of fishing, was with what's called a trammel net. Now, there's a particular kind of net that you could use in deep water, and it had this capability of snagging fish. And it's the method that Peter and Andrew and James and John would use when they went out fishing in the deep. But the one I want to look at just on this occasion is dragnet fishing. And for this, okay, let me just explain it. Yeah, I don't know whether you know, but the dragnet is it's a long curtain net, and it has floats along the top rope and weights along the bottom. And they need to have 2 teams of men on the shore, so it's usually a shore-based method of fishing. And you'd need a boat to unravel the net in an arc from one team to the other. And then the two teams would then pull the net towards the shore and eventually up the shore, and then it would bring lots of fish in with it. Because what the net is designed to do is to scrape along the bottom of the lake so that nothing is able to escape underneath the net. Okay, I'll just show you this picture here. But there are parts of the shore around the Sea of Galilee, and this is quite close to Capernaum, which are not suitable for dragnet fishing. So they couldn't have used it there. But other places, maybe near Magdala that we saw earlier, because the land there is sloping gently into the water, and it's basically you get a mud and sand bottom to the lake. Here, you've got all these boulders and rocks in the way, and so a dragnet would just not work because it would get snagged on the rocks. So what I want you to do now is just to turn in your Gospels, in your Bible, to Matthew chapter 13, which is the chapter about teaching on the kingdom. So Matthew chapter 13, verses 47 to 50. Jesus says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted out the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age." So what Jesus is talking about here is dragnet fishing. But unlike the assumptions that I made, and probably most people make, is that when it talks about the sorting out the good from the bad, we would normally think in terms of, well, this fish looks this is big and juicy, we'll keep that. This is a tiddly little fish, we'll throw that away. That's no good, we'll just throw it back. No, just sorting out the good and the bad in terms of the size of the fish was not what they were doing. What they were doing actually is sorting out the kosher from the non-kosher. So they were keeping the fish that they could eat and throwing away the fish that they couldn't eat. Now, because, as I've already explained, that the dragnet scraped along the bottom, so it would naturally have caused to gather together the bottom-dwelling fish like catfish and the shellfish, and these two kinds in particular, they could not be eaten by the Jews because their kosher laws forbade it. And there is this verse in Leviticus chapter 11, verses 9 and 10, which says that the requirement for the acceptable fish were that they were to have fins and scales. So this is just Jesus realizing what he's talking about is the good from the bad is the ones that are acceptable for the Jews to eat, and the other ones they just throw away. So here we are. That's a little light on the slightly obscure aspect of a kingdom parable, but fun nonetheless. Okay, well, I think that's probably a good time to draw a close. And if there's anything I want to, people would like me to explain more, then maybe I could.
Well, once again, Neville, thank you so much. That's just tremendously interesting. I don't know about you, but I didn't know every single one of those points, and I'm sure many people here have learned an awful lot tonight. So thank you so much for that. Just one or two things that came to my mind is that you said that Baal, the god of fertility and the god of storms. Well, one thing immediately sprang to mind is just as in Moses' time, when he went to Pharaoh to ask to let the people go and he wouldn't, God sent plagues. And the plagues that God sent were actually God saying, you think that Osiris of the Nile is a god? I'll show you who is God, and sent it to blood. Hecht, god of the frogs. So God sent them a plague of frogs. And Ra, the sun god, God sent darkness, and God each time was saying that he is God and there is no other. What did Jesus do in Galilee? He stilled a storm. He showed power over the storm god Baal.
Yeah.
And I haven't thought where fertility fits in, but that to me is kind of like made me think differently about the storm.
Yes.
I don't know, but
possibly. I mean, I'm not sure how much the disciples would have been thinking about Baal in the context there, but certainly it was a big deal in Elijah's time. It was the god Baal was just the Phoenician influence was very great in the 10 tribes of Israel. So it would have, and to understand Baal in that sense, that he was the fertility and storm god. And I just like the way that the whole contest is set up, completely skewed in favor of the Baal and the prophets of Baal. So they have no problem in turning up because they think it's going to be a walkover.
How many times does that happen in history? David and Goliath, yeah. But you see, if these things don't actually go away, Baal is still there in some, so therefore, anyway.
Yeah.
So that's that. But when you're talking about cisterns, this is just a very simple, practical thought. The family cistern had a very small opening at the top in order to keep bugs out and all the rest of it and all the rubbish. So I understood that. But if you wanted to collect rainwater, you need a reservoir, you need a large space to take the water to then pour it into a cistern. How does that work?
Well, usually you try and build your cistern where there's a sloping runoff that would naturally cause a very shallow funnel effect that would lead into, and naturally the water would collect because, it rains at night and you want to have automatically collecting that kind of water and not have to be on there in attendance when it's raining, so that when transferring it from one place to another before it disappears into the ground.
That's very good, because you were saying about the cracks in the plaster and so on, but that that would have brought in all the rubbish from the soil, so I couldn't think that was how it got into the smaller system. But that makes sense.
Yeah, but when you have cracks in the plaster, and if it's a significant crack, you get a mini earthquake overnight, something low on the Richter scale, and it's enough for the water just in a few days to seep out and disappear. And then
the actual water from the cisterns, yes.
The water to seep out of the cisterns into the surrounding ground because the plaster that you put there has failed because of a little earthquake has cracked it. So that's why Jeremiah refers to say the people have hewn out their own cisterns. They're broken cisterns that cannot hold water. So that's the man-made equivalent is rubbish, is the polite term.
It's so powerful, it's brilliant. So, I mean, you said that, they're on an earthquake belt and all of that. We know the medium earthquake, the last medium earthquake you said was 1927. But how long ago did they have the 400-year horrific earthquake? When was that?
I thought somebody would ask me that. I didn't have time to check it up. But it's quite a while, I think. Actually, I should have looked it up. I studied this a number of years ago, checked it up, and then the actual details are forgotten. But there are always certain dates in history in Israel, like 714. There was an enormous earthquake and that's the earthquake that destroyed Capernaum and all the areas around it. And quite a lot of places were never rebuilt after that particular one. And I think there was one in the 1300s and the one in the 1700s or something like that. So, in other words, the answer to your question is, we're due for another one.
Or maybe next century.
Well, who knows?
This is the 21st, isn't it? Yeah. Well, thank you. So I think really, you've answered my questions. I don't know if anybody else has got any. And if they have, you can still write in. And I really hope that you'll take on board the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ways you can connect on social media with CMJ. Anything that you want to look up, anything you've heard about tonight that you think might be interesting, just go to our social media, principally the website, for information and find out about it and join us. So I'd really like to thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to thank Neville tremendously for this Bible week. It's gone so quickly, the Spring Bible Week. It seems to have come and gone. And you've been riveting. We've all been fascinated listening to what you've had to say. So I'd like to pray for you in closing. Father God, I want to pray for Neville and Anthea. I pray that your blessing will rest upon them this night. We thank you for everything that Neville has put into preparing these talks for us and for delivering these talks to us. We pray, Lord, that you will use him mightily in your kingdom to spread the truth of your word and to your praise and glory. We praise you and thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you all and good night.